Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. I'm your host, Isaac Levin. If you're enjoying the interviews here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. Also, if you're interested or know any folks that would be interested in coming on chatting, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. My handle there is IsaacR11. All right, so with that out of the way, let's get to our guest, and I'm super excited for my guest today. My guest today is the one, the only Glenn Block. Glenn, do you want to say hello? Introduce yourself?
Hey, Isaac, thank you. Thank you. The one and the only Isaac Levin.
I only know one Glenn Block, so I know.
That's true. There is only one. Well, there is actually more than one. If you go on Google and search my name, you'll see a bunch of stuff from me, but there's also like Glenn Block, the orchestra director, and there's a couple of us out there, but
Yeah,
not many.
well, all the Glenn Blocks. Like I have a very popular name on the East Coast. So there's like 7 pages of Levins in the phone book, like in New York City. So my name is a bit more, I guess, common. I guess you could say.
I don't know if you know
Yeah.
this, but I grew up in New York,
Oh,
so
okay,
born
that's
and
great.
raised. That's the
X.
accent you probably hear under the semi-West Coast accent that has
Yeah,
developed over the last 20 years.
yeah, and I imagine when you go like when you get dropped back into like New York City or whatever, like the real accent just comes right through, right?
Or if I talk to somebody, like if I talk to somebody from New York or talk about New
Yeah.
York, I just go back. Yeah, it's pretty easy. I grew up in Long Island, by the way.
Yeah, excellent. Well, do you want to just give a quick intro to the folks who might not know who you are?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Glenn. Let's see. Been in the tech industry for a while. Started off my career as a software engineer, and then moved into product. A big turning point for me was when I joined Microsoft. So my first 10 years of my career was working as a software developer for various different companies. Ended up moving from the East Coast to the West Coast, getting laid off within 3 months. So that was the fun startup life back in those days, back in like 2001, 2002. And then ended up uh, going to Microsoft, and everything changed actually after that, and got to work on some really fun and impactful things.
Sure.
One of the things people know me most for is I was the PM who kind of drove ASP.NET Web API.
Hmm.
That was one of the big things that helped get off the ground at Microsoft, and also did a lot of work around bringing Node.js development to the cloud. Did a lot of engagement with the Node community and bringing Node to Azure. Um, and Yeah, so now I've kind of moved more into the leadership side of technology over the last 5 to 10 years. Most recently, I was a VP of product at a startup, and now I'm kind of in a Glenn 3.0, working on some
Sure.
interesting things to be determined.
Excellent.
And then I guess the other thing is, as I said, I grew up on the East Coast. I lived in Seattle for 17 years. And we recently moved to the Bay Area, which is actually a return for me because I was in the Bay Area for 5 years before moving to Seattle.
Okay. Awesome. Well, I think we're going to dive into a lot of the stuff that you've done over your career and some of the things that you're really passionate about. But I like to start our conversations with, a tech origin story. So, like, do you remember a point in time where you came across technology or, computers in general and you realized, like, this is the thing that I have a passion for this. I'm really interested in this. And this is something that I want to kind of continue learning more and more about?
Yeah, so 100%. So I started coding when I was like 7. Nobody in my family was into using computers. And I'll never forget that I went to the library and found this book. I used to love reading. This is at 7. Like, no, I went to the library, and there was this book on computer literacy for kids. And in it, it talked about the basics of like how computers work, binary, a little bit of basic, very little bit of basic. And I just got fascinated by it. I honestly think that was the first hook. And then I ended up like really getting excited about that. And I think my mom got me to go to a computer camp because I told her I was so excited about computers.
Sure.
And yeah, it just took off from there. I would say by like 11, 10, 11, I used to code, like I got my first computer, which was a VIC 20 at like 9 years old. And I used to code like all the time. And my dad didn't understand it, but he used to see me and say, "That's your future." And
Yeah.
I think by around 10 years old, I kind of felt like this is going to be what I'm going to do. I don't know how, but somehow I'm going to make it work. And I just kind of continually was drawn to it from that point on, and got more and more into it. By my teens, I was running a bulletin board system, and I was doing a lot of, like, in those days we didn't have the internet, but I
Yep.
would call up other bulletin boards, and I had my community of kind of hackers that I would talk
Sure.
to. And yeah, so it was a very young age, I think, that I just fell into it.
Yeah.
I was a very, believe it or not, back in those days, I was a very introverted kid. A lot of people, because now I'm like an extreme extrovert, but in those days, I was a big introvert. And so it was easy for me to like use computers as a thing because I didn't really want to like deal with people
Sure.
other than
Sure.
through a computer. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's definitely something to like, once you find like your community of folks that kind of have shared interests, is when you start to kind of be a bit more comfortable in that, that feeling of needing to be introverted kind of goes away. And it never really goes away. Like I'm an extreme extrovert as well, but occasionally, like I'll be like, I don't want to talk to anybody. Like I just want to sit in my office. Like I don't even want to talk to my kids. Like I don't. That's a terrible thing to say, but you know how it is. I think in general too. Go
I
ahead.
get that.
Yeah.
I really get that. And coding, when I used to be like really into coding,
Hmm.
coding has a way of pulling you in,
Yeah.
right? And like you get in the zone where you don't want to be interrupted. And I used to get so deep into it that even if I wasn't wearing headphones, it would almost be like I had headphones. Like people would talk to
Yeah.
me, I would not respond. I was
Sure.
like,
Sure.
I'm just and unfortunately, like you said, even my family.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I have memories of my daughter when she was like 2 or 3 wanting to play with me. And I was just like really like I was acting as if I
Yeah.
had headphones on, but I didn't.
Yeah, like this is probably a way off tangential thing, but I think that, that's one of the reasons, like, feel like in the last few years, a lot of folks that have in the tech industry have kind of came out and said that they have some form of neurodiversity, right? Like, I think that there's something to say is that tech kind of enables a certain kind of person to be really successful, like folks
Yeah.
that have ADHD, folks that have OCD, folks that have some form of autism. Like I think that there's a lot of traits that folks in tech have that if you kind of were to do like a Venn diagram, like, oh, like, like the need to focus, the need
Yeah.
to be able to drill down, like you said, like tune out the noise. And then also like, there are some things that people in tech have a really hard time with, like context switching or, communicating effectively to all sorts of audiences, right? And I've noticed this, and as somebody with ADHD, I've realized it too. It's like, oh, like there's a lot of people in tech that are neurodiverse that probably don't know about it, don't care to know about it. But I've seen a lot of people kind of have this awakening or this kind of this discovery about themselves just because we've been more open about having the conversation.
Yeah, and so I've been pretty open about the fact that, in the last year and a half, I got diagnosed with ADHD.
Yep.
A lot of people that know me would not be surprised
Sure.
about
Yeah. Yeah.
that. And to your
Yeah.
point, I know I've had so many people who've come out when I said it and said, "Oh, I have it too," or "Thank you for sharing." And I talked about my challenges and my superpowers, right? Because I
Yep.
think the a great book that I read on my journey, because I used to be what I would call an anti-ADHDer. Like,
Yeah.
because when I grew up and you came from the East Coast, I think we're not so far off from each other, but when I grew up on the East Coast, there was a lot of scares around Ritalin.
Yes.
Um, and ADHD was really like was not treated well. And I wasn't diagnosed then. But because of that, I had all these fears about ADHD. And my daughter was diagnosed. She's 18 now when she was 9. And that was a real moment for
Yeah.
me. And I remember the first thing I said when my wife told me was, I was like, she's not getting medication, right? Until
Yeah.
she was old enough and then decided she wanted it. But I learned a lot watching her. Like we can just learn so much if we open our minds. I had a very fixed mindset then and did a full like 180 to the point of finally finding out myself that I have it, embracing it, getting an ADHD coach. And to your point, I think there's some people that think that like tech is just randomizing, and because of that, like it almost breeds ADHD. But the more
Sure.
I've learned about it, it's like, no, like ADHD is like a neural problem. It's like
Yeah.
how your synapse, how the neurons fire and all of that. Is tech distracting? Sure. Is it randomizing? Sure. But the difference is like if you took away that randomization for the person that doesn't have ADHD, they'd be fine. The person who has ADHD, it doesn't matter if you take away that, that's still there. That's still the way they're going to operate. And I think what you're saying is true. I like the way you put it, which is not that tech is making people have it, but that tech by its nature is something that many people with ADHD can thrive in.
Yeah.
But then there's many that fall through the cracks.
Yeah.
But to your, like for me, one of my superpowers, like I like having multiple things going on at the same time.
Yeah.
I'm never happy just working on one thing. I will, if you give me one thing, I will find other things because
Yeah.
I'm just not, I get bored, I'm not satisfied. The other side is I can do really well at keeping multiple balls in the air, but I also have to be careful because I can
Drop
spread
all of them.
myself
Yeah.
thin and, and have that problem. So it's
Yeah.
like there's superpower there. And but thank you for sharing on that. By the
Yeah.
way, it's really
Oh, of
something I've
course.
tried to be really vocal about as I've learned, and I do think that society has grown and progressed. I also feel that in as much as what you're saying is true about how there's parts of tech that appear really well, tech in corporate America
Sure.
is
Yeah.
not really well structured for people, my opinion, for people
Yeah.
that suffer from ADHD. I've been able to survive, I've been able to do well, but it has been hugely taxing in ways that I think people that don't have ADHD don't suffer in the same way. Things that for them might be really simple are really hard for me. And it might look like, oh, Glenn's just being difficult. It's like, no, this is difficult for
Yeah.
me.
I have this conversation with people all the time about like, you know, Twitter, tech Twitter, or tech social media, whatever, right? Like that is just a very very small microcosm of just tech in general, right? Like our friend Scott Hanselman always talks about like the dark matter developer, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
where
Mm-hmm.
it's like you have all these folks that all they're doing is just clocking in, and that's great. Like if you can take care of your family off of being in tech and you don't have a passion for it, that's totally fine. Uh, but I think one of the things problems that I fall into occasionally, and I think a lot of people that are active on Twitter or active on Reddit or active on Discord or some of these other social media outlets, is the assumption that everybody in tech should just get it, right? Like, oh,
Yeah.
I get it. Everybody in tech should get it, but there's so many
Yeah.
people in tech that don't even frankly care, right?
Well, and I think a word that is being starting to get used more in tech that wasn't even a word that existed years ago, empathy,
Yes,
right? Like
yeah. Yeah, it's like the sole idea of like because I remember, and you've been there as somebody who's had to build line of business applications that weren't like for millions of people, they are for like tens of people in an
sure,
organization,
yeah,
right?
in an
Like
organization, help
yeah,
run the business, yeah,
yeah,
or 50
and
people,
I
or yeah,
remember when I was working those sort of jobs and building those sort of apps, like what did I care about the least? The way it looked, like specific edge cases, right? Like let's just get the thing to the customer, right?
yeah,
And the expectation is the customer would work around the worms or work around the whatever, right?
right.
They would figure out how to
Get it to
work within the
market quick,
system.
get it to them quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
How would they like how do they navigate this system that has flaws? And now like we're seeing now, especially like in realms of with accessibility, in realms of just great user experience, like you have to build these sort of things as tenants into when you build software, right? Which, 15 years ago, like if you had a developer on your team that like knew CSS kind of well, like you were leaps and beyonds better than like a lot of other teams that were around, right?
Yeah, totally. And I think, when you talk about like talking about the empathy thing, even myself, and we can learn and we can grow. And one of the things that I've really taken to over the last, I'd say, 4 to 5 years is this whole idea of growth mindset.
Mm-hmm.
That I mean, this real idea that, we're not just fixed who we are. We can change, we can learn. And early on in my career, I was not very empathetic. Like, I remember interviewing people and having a really high standard and just
Yeah,
being ready to just like kick them out of the interview because they couldn't meet the bar that
sure.
we were looking for. And it was like, there was very little empathy there, right?
Yeah.
There was empathy for you if you were like me.
Oh,
If you were,
sure.
because
Yeah.
then we'd be like, oh, we're like the small circle of people. I was in before I moved on to like big companies. I'm talking about like when my first part of my career as a software engineer. Yeah, I would often be very arrogant, right? Like, are you
Yeah.
good enough to work with me? If you were, I had empathy for you. And we had empathy for each other because the rest of the world were idiots. And we were,
Yeah.
yeah, not truly idiots, but
Yeah.
it was like, yeah,
And I think we're kind of now trying to back ourselves out of the problem that we introduced ourselves by only hiring people that were like us, right?
correct.
Like now we're in this world
Created huge
where,
problems.
yeah. So I think, how can we get more people that don't think like us, people that don't have the same background as us? How do we get them to thrive in tech and be interested in tech in general?
100%.
Because I think there is this assumption, even with all the strides that have been made in the last few years, that like tech is just not obtainable for some people, right?
Yeah. Well, and often that is because of access issues, not because
Yes.
of ability.
Oh, yes,
Um,
definitely.
it's so much of it is access, right? Like I always like I look at myself. I'm not like the best engineer in the world. I'm decent. I know I'm pretty good, but I know there were people that better than me that didn't get the opportunities that I
Yeah.
got. Why? A lot of things fell into place. Who my family was, my skin color, my gender. I mean, there's just so many things. And a
Yeah.
big one that I've learned about, especially as I've done more and more mentoring and sponsorship, is this idea of being in the room. Just knowing certain people is an access thing.
Yeah.
So many of my opportunities, I mean, at Microsoft, for example, I moved around so many times, and a lot of those opportunities came through people I knew. Well, if others were not like in the room where those conversations were happening, they don't get those opportunities. And so one of the things I try to do now is to speak up for those people,
Hmm.
to bring them into the room, even if they're not physically in the room. Yeah, there's so many built-in things so many built-in inequities that it's not ability, right? People say, like, even when people say, oh, there's not enough good engineers, there's the pipeline question, of course, that we can
Yeah.
go on that one forever. But it's like, oh, but it's like, okay, but is that because people don't have the ability to do it? Or is that because people have not been given access to the resources
Yeah.
that enabled them to get the skills? Those are two different things. And
Oh,
people like to lament it and make it like it's one and not the other. But reality of it is
yeah.
it's a system and access, which is the big problems.
Yeah, I think there's a ton of stuff in this particular space that we can talk about. And I think one of the things that's always very interesting to me is like, yeah, we talk all the time about there not being enough developers. There's too many tech jobs, right? And I think that we have this bias that like we need everybody to be like, the greatest microservice Kubernetes front end engineer. Like you need all the skills to be successful, right? And I'm very much of the mindset that if you introduce somebody that cares to something, if they're going to care and they're going to do what they can to help, right? We don't need everybody on the planet to be the best developer on the planet. But what we do need is people that care and have that empathy. And I think the struggle that we have a lot is that in a lot of sectors of tech in the broader like corporate tech industry, there's not a lot of empathy. So you get a lot of, and this is going to be a hot take, but like developers that quote unquote aren't that good, right? And what I mean by not that good is that they don't care, they don't want to learn new things, they um, are challenging to work with, and I say even though you can be successful in this sort of career, doesn't mean that this career is probably the best for you, right?
Yeah.
And I think that it goes both ways, which I think is really really challenging.
Yeah. By the way, there's some work happening outside my house. Is it noisy or is
Nope,
it okay?
nope. I can I heard something, but I wouldn't worry about it. It's not like
All
it's
right.
you know. Well,
All right, that's good because it's getting a little bit louder, but this mic should is a spatial mic, so hopefully it's not picking up all that sound. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there are people in our industry, a large portion of our industry that I would say has a very fixed mindset.
yes.
This is who I am. Why am I going to change, right? Like, what's this pronouns thing about? I don't, what's this thing? What's this,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's like, and it's kind of like, I have my beliefs. I'm going to stick to them, and it's like, but the world is changing,
Yeah.
right? And the world is evolving, and you need to evolve with it. And but we've got a lot of people in our industry who don't want to, who
Yep.
are just like, I'm just the way I am. I'm not going to change. You try to make me change, I'll just go somewhere else where I don't need to change. And
Yeah.
again, like and when you look at this whole concept of empathy and you look at even words like inclusion, that includes everybody, right? So it's like people can have different thoughts, but it's like, is your way of thinking getting in the way of other people being successful?
Yes.
That's when it's kind of not okay. And of course, a lot of this stuff is not, like a line in the sand. There's a lot
Mm-hmm.
of just grayness.
Yep.
But yeah, yeah, definitely.
And it's definitely challenging, and I think the more and more that we just are open and talk about it, right? Like there's going to be a point in time 20 years from now where I guess the when the next generation are the key demographic for developers, and the older generations, folks like us are cascading into our retirements, or in your case, enjoying your retirement. It's gonna be very very interesting to see like what the landscape looks like, right? Are
I,
I'm
I'm
ex-
happy to see it
yeah,
changing,
yeah,
honestly. I'm
yeah,
happy to see the old things, even the things that I used to do, being
yeah,
questioned and people
yeah,
saying, like, hey, like, just because we did something for a long time didn't make it right. And I
yeah,
think that's another thing you get. It's almost like in my, when I went back to school in my executive MBA, we learned a lot about sunk cost, this idea of sunk cost. Like, I put so much in.
yep,
And it's like, at the end of the day, sunk cost has nothing to do with success. The
yeah,
fact that you put a bunch of money into a thing and a bunch of time and resource doesn't mean it's the right thing to keep going, right?
yeah,
And I think in a different way, people have this sunk cost idea of like, this is who I've been, this is how our industry has been. Why should we change
yeah,
it, right? It's like we put so much in.
yeah,
And this often comes up from the people who are not feeling the impacts, right? It's
yeah,
like they're in a place where like somebody's I'll just use a perfect example. And I know a lot of people said it was like, but like when GitHub decided to change, from master as the
yep,
branch,
mm-hmm.
and like all these people came out and like, no, like you should, but then it's like they're not the people that are affected and
Yeah,
that are triggered when the term is used,
yes,
but people that were who are saying, well, I really don't feel great seeing this, right?
yeah,
And it's like just a small example of where it's like you got the one side of people who are like, oh, can't we like move on, like this is stupid, blah 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 blah, who are not the people generally that are affected, other than being affected in changing the way they do things to accommodate those who are feeling impacted and affected.
oh
It just
sure,
really that plays out over and over again whenever change, uh, you know,
yeah,
whenever
I
there's
think
change.
yeah, it's very very interesting because in general, like the people that are usually the loudest are the people that are probably the least affected by some particular change, right?
I
Like
agree.
there's always this thing. It's like, why is the minority always the loudest? you have this across every spectrum of society, whether it be politics or religion or whatever, right? The people that like, it affects the least and like are the
Are the
and the
most
smallest
vehement
groups.
opposers.
Yes.
Yeah,
And
because people, because, and that gets to that whole concept of privilege, right?
yeah,
Because they can't,
yeah,
because like everything's okay. I always use this example of like, oh, I was having a great day, like before I met you, before we talked, and
yeah.
suddenly making me feel bad and telling me that the things I'm doing I need to change. And it's like, oh, I'm just gonna go away now and shut you
Yeah,
off, shut you down because
yeah.
I don't do that.
Yeah, you mentioned something that I thought was kind of interesting, and I'd like to kind of talk a little bit about. You mentioned GitHub and how GitHub has made some changes to be more
Yeah,
inclusive. Like you were a key part of like the .NET team and their kind of adoption of GitHub, right?
I
Like,
was definitely part
yeah,
involved with that.
yeah. I would love to kind of
Early,
hear your
early,
thoughts about.
early,
Yeah,
early days.
yeah,
I mean, I joined not really as well. I worked on the managed extensibility framework, and that was before GitHub was even really a huge thing. At that
yep,
time, we had Codeplex,
yep,
but I was very involved with bringing the first parts of the .NET framework to open source.
yeah,
And later on, of course, when as GitHub really blew up, I worked in the Azure team on the Azure SDK for Node.js, which was all built on GitHub, and
mm-hmm,
that was like a huge thing. Of course, then MVC came over, and Managed Extensibility Framework ultimately kind of went there, and Web API all went there. They all went there.
yeah.
Um, yeah,
Yeah, I'd like to, obviously, you know, history being what it is, right? Like, I think that now looking back, like, oh, that's a no brainer. Like, obviously, like doing sort of these things. But I imagine internally, there was all sorts of like lovely discussions about how is this going to affect the way people work? How is this going to affect public perception? I think, full disclosure, both Glenn and I in the past have worked for Microsoft. We now no longer work at Microsoft, and we're going to talk about Microsoft for a second. Like, Microsoft kind of has this, I guess you could say, and this is not the best way to say it, but baggage
yeah.
around certain,
Linux, like Linux is a
yes,
cancer. Let's
yeah,
just
like
call it what it is. I
yeah,
mean,
around
it wasn't hidden.
yeah. So,
Open
but
source is
there's
cancer.
these
Linux is a cancer.
yeah, but there's these specific things that I think Microsoft in the past would like to have done differently, and they've spent the last 20 years or so attempting to rectify some of those things. And you were, like you mentioned, sort of a part of that. Like,
Yeah,
what from your perspective, obviously you don't need to share every gory detail, but I'd love to kind of hear like what those
yeah.
conversations were like. Like, was it, I imagine a lot of people were very for it, and a lot of people were, I don't see the value in this. Not against it, but I just don't see the value in it.
I think
So
a lot is a stretch.
sure.
Early on, there were some big champions, and
Yeah.
definitely have to call out Scott Guthrie because almost everything I did around open source, Scott had some, you know, he was there,
Yeah.
like, and kind of like looking at that. A good friend of mine who's not at Microsoft anymore, Brian Goldfarb, also were big, they were big supporters and saw the potential and saw the richness of like, hey, if we have a more open community and how we can leverage open source, how it's good for the industry, and looking at other communities and other languages. And, obviously, I think a big shakeup for Microsoft actually was Rails. Um, Rails was a huge shakeup because lots of Microsoft developers were getting on board with this Rails thing. There was interest. There was interest in a different way of doing things,
Yeah.
and it was very open source sort of driven, lighter weight tools. Even ASP.NET MVC, I mean, came out of like, how can we do something better that is more on par with what people are looking at things
Yep.
like for like Rails. There was a lot of fear. I think in those days, the core of Microsoft was Windows. That's
Sure.
really changed. Or you could say it's changed in the sense that Azure is Windows of the cloud, right? Some people
Sure.
will
Yeah.
say that. But there was a lot of fear. I remember particularly when we were trying to bring MEF to open source, to release it under an open source license, there was pushback of like we should make this only work on Windows, right? Like and we had we originally released it. We released the source under a license that only allowed it to work on Windows, and got a
Yeah.
huge pushback from Miguel, who at that time was the head of the Mono project and was not part of Microsoft. Although later on that all
Sure.
changed. And that's how Miguel and I first became friends after I blogged on, the managed extensibility framework and becoming open, I think I called it open source or release the source. And, he's like, don't use the managed extensibility framework. I'm like, oh, thanks. I'm a PM on that team.
Yeah. Exactly.
And I'm the one who pushed the
Exactly.
source to get released. But I think there was fear. I think it's like people are afraid of things they don't know. I think it was like a business fear, right? Like, will this hurt Windows?
Mhm.
For me, in those days, I was like a pretty low level PM within Microsoft, and to be brought into this conversation with a lot of really big people talking, weighing these things out and being like, wow, I'm working on, this. It's one of the cool things about working at companies like Microsoft. Even if
Yeah.
you're fairly junior, you can work on things that attract a lot of attention and that push a lot of buttons. So I think there was just fear. I think it was, like as Satya came in, and obviously Scott planted a lot of the foundational seeds for a while. But when Satya came in, really from the top down in the company, really giving it a new level of
Yeah.
energy. And I think, like during the early days, I think it was like growing, and there were champions that were getting on board, but you still had very strong people who were very much against it, like Sanofsky, for example. Um, I think over time, and when finally like the CEO of
Yeah.
Microsoft was, we're going to do this, then people who before could like yell and didn't want to get in line with that vision had no choice, like either get in line or go somewhere else. So it was interesting to watch, because in the early days it was definitely like a lot of people didn't understand it. Even a lot of the hardcore Microsoft like community people, there were a lot who thought open source was awful. They were just towing the Windows line, like the Microsoft, the traditional Microsoft line. But over time, that started to change, even
Yeah.
in the .NET community. Like more and more people in the .NET community started to look. I think Java had a huge influence.
Sure.
Like people looked at what was going on in Java and the way everything was like a library that you could get, and how in the Microsoft community in the early days, it was pretty much like the major things came out of Microsoft. There were third parties that you could buy stuff for, like controls. There were things Microsoft didn't really care
Yeah.
about, like Sheridan controls, like graphic control. But like a lot of the core stuff was all
Yeah.
Microsoft.
Baked
You
into
went
the
to
framework.
Java,
Yeah.
it was not that way.
Yeah.
Like there were large open source projects that pretty much the whole Java community used. And I think more and more, and the other thing I think too is that Microsoft was always very tooling based, heavily tooling based. And Microsoft can do great tools, but tools can also get in the way of almost like, lack of a better word, lipstick on a pig
Yeah. Sure.
terminology,
Sure.
kind of just kind of taking something that is messy and cleaning it up with tools, but then you still end up with something that's messy after the fact, even though the
Yeah.
tools got you there faster. Whereas, like in the Java world, there was a lot more about like patterns, embracing like design patterns and ways of doing things that were more maintainable, that didn't require tons of tooling to do it. And so my first kind of intro to that actually was when I joined the Patterns and Practices team, because the Patterns and Practices team used to be a big thing at Microsoft, because it was in those days like the .NET framework shipped every 3 years. There was no open source, no anything. And the Patterns and Practices team was there as like this team to kind of help bridge the gaps between things that are not in the platform, but that are emerging as real exciting patterns outside of the
Yeah.
Microsoft ecosystem, like in the Java world, and design patterns was a big central to that. So yeah, I mean, I think over time things started to shift, and with the power structure changing, like there was a bottoms up approach that was happening, and I was part of that. And then Hanselman came in and was part of that, and Phil Hack was part of that. And there were a few other things that happened, like, Iron Ruby and Iron Python and some of these other efforts. But once it got to that critical mass, and I think Azure actually had a huge part to Microsoft's adoption of the cloud and the realization that, any stacks that we don't support, that's just business we're saying goodbye to.
Yes.
Like, if you're running your stuff in our cloud, we want you to be able to run whatever you can, because if we don't do that, you're not going to want to use it, right? And then you're just going to go bring your business elsewhere. So I actually think that although there were all the seeds, I think it was the shift to the cloud at Microsoft that really propelled the adoption of open source.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely talk about the changes that have happened, right? Like in the last 10 years, like we've gone from .NET being Windows only, you basically can
Three
only
year
build.
three year release cycles.
Yeah, 3-year release cycles. You can only use Visual Studio. Now you have this ecosystem where NuGet is the number one way that people get things.
Yes.
Obviously, .NET runs on any platform. It runs on basically any device. There's Azure is predominantly Linux based operating system underneath the hood. You run into situations where we have free tools like VS Code and great support for other non Microsoft built IDEs. I think, it's crazy to think in just a short amount of time, we've gone from like this very, I guess you could say, fixed mindset to this very
Yes. Growth.
give us
Yeah.
every single opportunity to have success. Right now, Microsoft has their own version of the JDK. They have tons of people whose sole responsibility is to make sure Python tooling is great and Node tooling is great. And I think that only benefits all of technology, right? When big tech companies like Microsoft, like Google, like Amazon, they're all building solutions that are going to not just positively affect their bottom line, but also make being a developer less painful. Because I talk about this all the time. Like being a developer is very painful. Like we spend hours and hours and hours like with build errors, with compilation errors, with things not looking the way we want to. And we put up with all that nonsense because when it works, it feels so
Versioning
good. Versioning,
problems.
versioning problem,
Yeah,
naming
versioning
problems.
is a nightmare.
Yeah, because all that pain, the one time it works, like that drives you for weeks, right?
Yeah, or
And
months.
yeah, and I tell people this when they're joining tech. I'm like, you have to be a little bit of a masochist, right? Like you have to be okay with a little bit of pain because the reward is so worth it.
Yeah.
And for some people, that they just need that immediate satisfaction, that gratification all the time, that slow dopamine drip. That's not tech. Like
No.
it's very, very hard to get that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, talking about when you talked about the bottom line, I think the other thing we learned, though, when you look at Microsoft's adoption of open source, is the bottom line does matter.
Yes.
Like the thing that I mean, reality of it is that when the business morphed into a model that naturally lent itself to where you not only could do open source, you really needed it. Like you were just throwing away revenue if you
Yeah.
didn't embrace it.
Sure.
Literally, right?
Yeah.
Even the hard and true Microsoft customers who at one point had this huge loyalty to the pure Microsoft stack, many had moved away from that. And they're like, no, like we're not going to operate that way. So I think that you can't downplay the importance of the finding a business model that aligns. I think if, to be honest, like if Microsoft hadn't found a successful business model to make money with open source,
Yeah.
we'd probably be very similar to the old days.
Sure.
But it took curiosity to do that. And, a willingness to, look at things in a different light. But yeah, but
Yeah.
it's cool. It's really awesome thinking about the days when we first brought like the managed extensibility framework to Codeplex to then see now like .NET, for example, completely open source, developed in the open, all like you said, all packages.
Yeah.
It's definitely a different world than it was then.
Yeah, and as we kind of transition, kind of like the chronology in Glenn's career, like eventually you left Microsoft and you went to do, things and trying to solve different problems for different organizations. Like so, obviously in your post Microsoft career, what were some of the things that you worked on that you look back on and you think, oh well, I think we did something good there.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I was most proud of was actually when I joined Splunk. That's where like, when I left Microsoft, I went right to Splunk. That was
Sure.
and at the time, a lot of people were like, why are you doing that? Like, at the time, people like Phil, for example, had gone back to GitHub, and a lot of people who had been in product decided to go back toward engineering. I love product. Like, even though I started off my career as an engineer and I still love writing code, I really see the value of having people that are focused on just really understanding the customer problem,
Yeah.
and making sure that the experience is the right experience. And, then engineers are building it. And there's like they work together, but I definitely was not at a place where when I left, if anything, I went deeper into product and product management
Yeah.
than going back the other direction. But Splunk was a really interesting space for me because of my first time really working in a company that was very Linux based. A lot of their customers were Linux. And it was like, for me, like I had worked with Linux well before I joined Microsoft. I had dabbled with it. But a lot of my career was spent like working on Microsoft stuff, with Microsoft technology. And then even as I got into things like Node.js, like it was still us doing it at Microsoft, right?
Sure.
So and you had companies that Microsoft acquired that were doing open source, like Skype was a big one. They brought a lot of open source when they were acquired. Um, but for me, I wanted to like work at a company where they're not like trying to do it. Like, it's hard to explain, but like this is just what they do. This
Yeah.
is who they are. I wanted to get like a almost non-Microsoft perspective on open source. So
Yeah.
when I had the opportunity to join Splunk, I thought the the data analytics space was fascinating. Big data space was fascinating and different. So I would say my thing that I was most proud of is when I joined Splunk, it was still a very IT-based product. Splunk is is a product that can gather data from anywhere, or you can send
Sure.
it data from anywhere. But traditionally, it was deployed by IT. And what was happening was the industry was shifting towards DevOps and some NoOps, and it was just becoming a world where that IT person who just like manages the servers and deploys them just may not exist, right? It's
Yeah.
like a
Yeah.
developer who's deploying stuff, a developer who's doing all this, and they don't want to deal with like setting up agents that they have to like run on machines to like capture data. They also don't want to deal with very enterprisey management things. They just like, I just want to get my job done.
Yep.
And so we saw an opportunity to create a new way for developers to get their data into Splunk that was compatible with things like containers and serverless and other things like that. Actually, Amazon became a huge partner and adopter of the technology that I worked on.
Hmm.
And so what was really exciting for me was that was like a turning point where Splunk was trying to figure out like, hey, this approach that we're using, that's going to limit us. That's going to limit us, and almost like handwritings on the wall, that the way that we kind of got our penetration in the market is shifting. We need something better. And it was a lot of work because we had things that kind of did what customers wanted, but not at high scale.
Sure.
So I worked on a project where our goal was to be able to support 100 million events being sent per second.
Yes.
And so we had to build out a really, and this was something that you had to be able to run in your own environment. So it was the most interesting thing I ever worked on that had to be able to support immense scale. And you could literally just throw servers at it and it will grow and it will manage all of that for you. And, some really, really large companies that I can't manage mention all got all over this, and
Yeah.
it created hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue opportunities at Splunk through partnerships that were
Mhm.
built on top of this technology. It was a great team, definitely the most high scale thing I ever worked on, and yeah, it was definitely like it was just the whole journey of building out that product. And I think the thing I love about product management is when you can identify a gap, a serious gap, and then you can look at like how do we make that better,
Yeah.
and you can close that loop. So with that one, we definitely closed that loop and people were really excited about it, and still to this day, it's heavily adopted. And I remember after I left Splunk, at one point Amazon added baked in support for this technology. It was called the event collector, the HTTP event collector, and Amazon like added support so that if you could basically, if you're using Splunk, you could natively in AWS, you could like push all your events and logs
Yep.
that AWS is capturing right to this event collector. And that was after I left, but when I saw that, I was like,
Yeah.
wow, this is
Yeah.
awesome.
I mean, it's safe to say, like, if a company or startup comes along with some technology, like it almost feels like there is some the industry in general is like, oh, like I want that. And no matter how big a company is, like they'll gravitate towards it. Like you take, Elasticsearch for instance, right? Like,
Hmm.
somebody creates a really, really good tool and everybody adopts it, right?
Yep.
And I think, you see this time and time again where you have some, open source technology or technology in general that is kind of built by a community of people, not by an organization, but by a community of people. And that builds this really great track record of, okay, this is a trusted thing because it's not just some company trying to make money. And you eventually see that those things then become adopted by these huge companies, which I think is really, really interesting. Like you say, Elasticsearch, for instance, or Apache Pulsar, or a lot of these like miscellaneous like services or open source projects that just all of a sudden get adopted by huge companies because they see it as the de facto standard, right? What are your thoughts in
Yeah,
general
yeah,
about
no,
that?
and this one was interesting because this was definitely not open source, right?
Oh,
This was,
sure. Proprietary
but
thing. Yeah.
but Splunk started that way,
Yes.
right? Splunk had so much penetration in the market, and people loved it, and it did so well that it was able to charge a lot of money
Yeah.
to the point that later on people would gripe about it. They'd be like, "Well, I love Splunk, but I can't afford it." I'm like,
Yeah.
"Well, I hear you." I'm like,
Yeah.
"People love Ferrari too. Not everybody can afford them."
I
Right?
one of my best friends, he works at a very, very well known tech company, and he kind of ran up their observability business. Like that's one of his jobs, and like he would just say, like he would,
Shout out to Honeycomb who really
yeah,
put that term out there in the market.
yeah. But he was telling me is like we have no option other than to like he didn't he I won't say it was Splunk, but there was another provider similar to Splunk, and
Yeah,
he's like, we
yeah,
literally have no other option. Like
yeah.
the feeds are so good, our telemetry is basically schemed away in a way to work best in their system. They can charge whatever they want. And
Right.
this is a company that if I was to say the name, everybody would know them, right?
Yeah.
And their entire telemetry system is built
Stickiness.
is stickiness, right? Even to the
Yeah.
effect that they were looking to get off of it, and the amount of money and effort that it would take to
Get
basically
off.
get off of it
Not
was
worth
the
it.
was not even close to
Lock
worth
in.
it.
It's the
Yeah.
vendor. It's the fear of the vendor lock
Yeah,
in.
but it's just crazy to think that you have that ability to be so sticky for something. I mean, and not to downplay like the value that Splunk brings, the value that others, in this space brings, but like it's literally just collecting log data and telemetry. Like it's not like some super crazy AI
Well, I think
powered thing, but it is.
it's evolved way more than
Yes.
what you think. It
Yeah.
does have AI now.
Yeah,
It
of
does.
course. Yeah.
I mean, it became a beautiful thing that Splunk did. I think from a business perspective was the Splunk ecosystem, the apps.
Yeah.
There was like Splunk itself, but then there were all the apps. Like at the time when I was at Splunk, 30% of Splunk customers use this thing called enterprise security,
Yep.
which built on top of Splunk to give you like a very first class experience around, like monitoring security
Hmm.
breaches and things like that.
Yeah.
So, in its essence, it was simple. But an interesting thing about Splunk, though, is in as much as there were some things that was lock in, it almost had a reverse lock in because of its flexibility. Because the cornerstone of Splunk was you can send it data, any kind of data.
Yep.
And so the problem with that was that, like, once you get used to that as a company, it's hard to be like, how can I move away from a thing that will do anything
Yes.
to
Yeah.
something that will do less than anything, or
Yeah.
10 tools that will do less? So it was really interesting. But open source story. So when we were working on, so when I joined Splunk, I took over all their SDKs. And so one of the SDKs we had was a very old C# SDK. So back in the day, remember portable class libraries?
Yeah.
PCLs were a thing, and Xamarin was, around. Obviously, it had been around. And so I was like, well, we need to rev our .NET library. We need a PCL. Like we should create a PCL because it's going to work for iOS and it's going to work for because you could
Yeah.
use the Xamarin and it's
Because
going
you
to work
can run
everywhere.
.NET anywhere, so we need to be
And
a
we should do
PCL
it.
so it could. Yeah.
And I
Exactly. Yeah.
pushed for that. I pushed for that. There's a couple of times you make decisions in your. I pushed for that. And Splunk were not huge C# fans. So that was like a big fight to be like, no, we should do this. And here's why. So here's a cool collaboration story, though, between me and a guy, Martin Learman from Elasticsearch SDK. So we were building out our C# SDK as a portable class library. It was all open source on
Sure.
GitHub. Everybody had access to it because it wasn't the core product, right? It was the SDKs of the product. And we ran into this weird issue that .NET had around rewriting around URLs.
Sure.
Um, and I created this library called Purity that would use some hacks to hack around the URL issues that we were running into. And it was well known that this was like a thing in the .NET framework, and there was a way to hack around it using certain settings and certain classes. You could hack around this URL issue where it was basically not rewriting the URL properly when it
Sure.
got parsed by the libraries. So I created this library called Purity, and it was out there open source, and it was like our SDK depended on it. I pulled it out as its own thing because once you get into like the open source mindset, you're like building something, you're like, oh, this could be used for something else. I don't know what it'll be used for. Well, Elasticsearch picked it up. So the Splunk SDK and the Elasticsearch SDK were both using this library called Purity, but even better, Martin was contributing to it.
Yeah.
And Martin on Elasticsearch. So I was like, that was just a really
That's
cool
awesome.
collaboration story. Forgive me, Martin, if I borked your name. But yeah, the Purity library, we both worked on it, and it was like we were flat out competitors. But it's like that library, and I think the reason we were able to do it too is like that library wasn't our competitive edge, right? Like
Yeah.
that library, I'm sure it would have been a lot harder if it was like the core engine piece that both
Yeah.
Elasticsearch and Splunk were
Yeah.
sharing. But it
Yeah.
was a fun story.
It is quite fascinating how like enemies make great bedfellows, right? When it's needed, right? Like I always joke about the fact that it's like, oh, not to bring up Microsoft again, but Microsoft has partnerships with Amazon and
Oh
Google,
yeah, the world has
right?
changed.
Like
Google.
yeah, like for instance, like you can run Android apps on Windows now, right? Using the
Yeah.
Amazon App Store. So it's like you're running a version of Android, which is a Google product. You're running that on Windows using a distribution mechanism from Amazon. It's like the three biggest clouds together. Like, and to be honest, like, they all hate each other. Like, but they'll also love each other because it's about bringing value to customers in any way possible.
Yeah.
And that is what's really exciting to me about tech now is like these big companies that would literally they would spend far more time litigating each other than working together to bring value to customers. And now, you know, like you mentioned, Splunk and Elasticsearch, literally competing products, or big tech companies that might
By
be
the way,
fighting.
I don't know if my CEO of Splunk knew that. At the time, our
Well,
CEO wasn't really big keeping a huge eye on open source.
yeah,
But yeah, if he's
no,
listening, and he's probably not watching the show,
it is,
Godfrey Sullivan, our former CEO. But
but it is quite exciting, right? Like this idea of like all of us working together to for the greater good, and that's why I think open source is so important because like, and this is gonna like not to go down a rabbit hole, but the whole idea of Kubernetes, right? Google
hmm
creates Kubernetes. It just immediately becomes adopted basically as, hey, this is what we need to use for microservice architecture based solutions. Like, this is what we need to do. This is a great opportunity to, for container orchestration to the effect that there's like no other, like, there are, but not anywhere nearly as adopted. There's other container orchestration mechanisms, but nothing like Kubernetes, right? And now you see like every major cloud having their own managed version of Kubernetes. And every big SaaS solution, like whether it's Elasticsearch or Splunk or Datadog or whoever, has basically ways for you to run their products in your own Kubernetes clusters, right? So like, and Kubernetes is an open source tool. Like, sure, it's managed and maintained by Google, but everybody contributes to all these companies because they recognize, if I can make sure that the customer experience using this tool is outstanding, it's going to grow. It's going to basically develop growth of my usage of my product, right? And that's what's really exciting about open source in general, is the opportunity to collaborate. And like I always joke, there's enough money out there for everybody. Let's be real. Like, there's no, like, we don't need to compete at all. Like, there's enough money literally for everybody. Um,
I like the
so
way you think. I like the way
yeah,
you think. Oh, I think at the end of the day, what one thing I think that is I love about open source is it really does put power back in the customers' hands, in the sense of, like you said, like look at Docker, for example, right? Like, so one of my other early things was containers were exploding, and I
yep,
was like pushing at Splunk with my friend Dennis, like, we need to do something around containers. And this is before it exploded, but the handwriting was on the wall, and it was like, imagine the future, everybody's gonna be running Splunk on containers.
yep,
They're not going to be running it on, so we need to figure this out, and they're going to want to monitor their containers. And so, but if you look at that, like, the container adoption initially was all very organic.
yeah,
Like, Docker was pushing it initially, um, but the community took it on and really saw the value, and then that kind of, and that puts power, because then it's like, hey, cloud provider, like, I want you to support Docker, or I want you to support Kubernetes. And if you don't, I mean, why does Azure, like, people be like, oh wow, look at Microsoft, like Azure has AK, their Kubernetes service. It's like, well, if they don't, somebody's going to find it somewhere else. So but it's that power, right?
yep,
It's like the customer's able to dictate it, because, say, look, I want this thing, and hey, service, if you don't support it, well, I'll just go find somebody who does.
yeah,
And I think that is good to have that balance where, I think in the past, and I know we keep calling out Microsoft, but I think it was a very, like, Microsoft centric view of the world. Like, what do we think? Like, what do we imagine we want the world to be? And what do we want you to use? And I think open source has absolutely changed that and shifted that in a good way.
yeah. And I think, as we wrap up the discussion, like, this is, why I wanted to talk to you, right? Like, and before, just for folks that are tuning in, like, before we got on, like, I give this whole spiel to all my guests, and I was telling Glenn, like, if you're just happy with the conversation at the end of the hour, that's all that matters. Because if we both are passionate about technology and open source, it's going to convey, and it's going to be a great conversation. And I think this has been a great conversation. And as we wrap up, like, Glenn, is there like any parting words or things you'd like to shout out or call out as we kind of wrap up the show?
I think, we're talking about open source, and we had some earlier discussions around, like, inequities. I know people are tired of
Yeah,
hearing me say it, but, I think when we look at open source and we look at the way things are evolving, we really do have to work harder to make open source be something that more people feel comfortable participating in. And we stand to lose if we don't,
Yeah.
because the more perspectives there are, like we've already seen, like the software that we're building today, we have so many problems where software we've built just excludes lots of people. And part of that is because the people that work on it have a one specific perspective. So, the more people we can get involved, the more welcoming we can make the open source ecosystem and community, the better off we're all going to be. And honestly, yeah, we'll make more money, but it's not just about the money, but
Yeah.
it matters. So, business certainly matters.
I 100% agree with everything that you just said. Thank you for that. And I want to thank you for being
Yeah,
on the
thank
show.
you, Isaac.
This has been a pleasure. We've spoken briefly a few times, but it was good to sit down and have a long conversation. And as we wrap up, I love to ask my guests one final question, and that question is as simple as: if you could think of technology and open source, the community around it, the feeling that you have, but you only had one word to describe that feeling, what word would you choose?
Possibilities.
Possibilities. That's a great answer. I love it. And, again, thank you so much for your thoughts on open source and tech in general. It's been a pleasure, Glenn. And, for folks that aren't already following Glenn, is Gblock on Twitter. And you can find him all sorts of other places too. And, as we wrap up, Glenn, anything last to say?
Well, you asked, going back to what you said early on, I definitely feel happy. I've enjoyed this conversation. Loved the organic back and forth and the way it evolved. And we didn't know where it was going to go, but certainly leaving happy and I'm grateful for you for creating this space for us to have the conversation. It was also fun to think about some of the old days.
Yeah, sure.
And to look at, it's just really important to look at the progress and things that have changed. So we're not in exactly the same place we were, which is a good thing. But we have to stay vigilant and can't stop. We still got a lot of work to do.
That I couldn't have phrased it any better myself. So thank you for everybody tuning in or listening in the future. This has been Coffee and Open Source. That's Glenn. This is Isaac. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
Bye, everyone.